Welcome to the podcast. Today I have a very special guest, Nathan Bryan. Dr. Bryan has been involved in nitric oxide research for the past 25 years, and he's made many seminal discoveries in the field and has dozens of patents issued and more than 100 peer-reviewed science journals. He's a best-selling author and a successful entrepreneur who has built billion-dollar enterprise value portfolio of companies all around nitric oxide. He is currently the founder and chairman and CEO of Bryan Therapeutics, a privately held clinic-stage biotechnology company that's actively engaged in the discovery and development of nitric oxide-based therapies. BTI has active drug development programs in heart disease, Alzheimer's disease, topical drugs for diabetic ulcers and non-healing wounds. He's got a consumer line of products that is one of the most innovative and successful nitric oxide products on the market. And Dr. Bryan is an international leader in molecular medicine and nitric oxide biochemistry. He earned his BS in biochemistry from UT Austin, his doctoral degree from LSU School of Medicine, and his postdoc training at Boston University Whitaker Cardiovascular Institute. Please welcome Dr. Bryan onto the show. Hey guys, welcome to the podcast. Today I'm super excited to have a specialist here, Nathan Bryan. Nathan, tell us a little bit about yourself. How did you get into this world of nitric oxide?
Nitric oxide. Oh, thanks, Brad. It's good to be with you. I'm a small town Texas boy. I grew up just outside of Austin, in a town of about 1,000 people, a town called Lexington. Went to high school in Caldwell, then went to the University of Texas and got a degree in biochemistry. And then quickly realized that the job market for a bachelor's degree in biochemistry wasn't great. So I realized to accomplish my goals, I needed to further my education. So I enrolled at LSU School of Medicine. I got a PhD in molecular and cellular physiology, and from there I did a fellowship in cardiology and vascular biology at Boston Medical Center. And then after a 2-year postdoc, I was recruited by Fred Murad, the guy who had won a Nobel Prize for the discovery of nitric oxide, to join the Institute of Molecular Medicine. And that was part of the University of Texas Medical School in Houston. So that was my first faculty position. But really, from the time I was a student to my postdoctoral fellowship, and even throughout my 20 years of faculty in academia, it's been really revolved around research around nitric oxide, this gas that's naturally produced, that's a very important molecule for human health and human optimization.
And tell us a little bit about what this molecule is and what it does for the body.
Well, it's a gas. It's what we call a signaling molecule. It's naturally produced in the lining of the blood vessels. In fact, it's produced by most cells in the human body. But it's a signaling molecule. It's how cells in the body communicate. But when it was first discovered, it was discovered to be a vasodilator. So when it's produced, it dilates the blood vessels. So now we can improve blood flow and circulation. But now we know it's involved in oxygen delivery, not just vasodilation, but oxygen delivery, improvement mitochondrial function, the energetics of the cell, how we efficiently produce cellular energy, ATP, from oxygen. It mobilizes our own stem cells so we can repair and recover from injury. It prevents our telomeres from getting shorter, which predicts our lifespan. And so everything we know about the aging process and the onset and progression of age-related chronic disease all revolves around the adequate production of nitric oxide. And in fact, the loss of nitric oxide production is the earliest event in the onset and progression of chronic disease.
Wow. And how did you guys come to realize that that was the earliest measurable change?
Well, if you look at the day when I started in this field in the late 90s, so a Nobel Prize was awarded in 1998 in physiology or medicine to 3 U.S. scientists, because collectively they discovered that nitric oxide is a signaling molecule in the human body. And it was first realized that there's something called endothelium-derived relaxing factor, or EDRF, discovered in 1980. And then later was discovered that that EDRF is actually nitric oxide. So during that interim, of 8 to 10 years, there was a lot of studies looking at endothelial function or vascular function in people. And what they realized was that when you develop endothelial dysfunction, which means that the endothelial cells, the cells that line all blood vessels throughout the body, can no longer do their job, they become dysfunctional, that your arteries become stiff and rigid, you develop high blood pressure, you get rapid plaque deposition, and then you get the onset and progression of atherosclerosis or cardiovascular disease, which is the number one killer of men and women worldwide. So when you start to look at the functional changes in nitric oxide, it precedes the structural changes you see in people with cardiovascular disease by many years, in fact, sometimes decades. So a person who has obstructive coronary disease or ischemic heart disease today, you can trace it back, it happened 30 or 40 years ago when they started developing endothelial dysfunction and lack of nitric oxide production that then allowed for the onset and progression of vascular disease.
And describe for our listeners what are the endothelial cells and what is their purpose?
The endothelial cells it's a single layer of cells that line all blood vessels throughout the body and even the lymphatic system. So it was once thought, in the 60s and 70s, it was thought that the endothelial cells are simply a barrier, right? They prevent things from inside the circulatory system from getting through and into the interstitium and into tissues. But now we know that these are, vasoactive mediators. They're endocrine mediators. And so they secrete vasoactive substances, things like nitric oxide, which dilates the blood vessels. They secrete vasoconstrictors like endothelin. But it's the second-to-second regulation of vasodilation, vasoconstriction that regulates blood flow to every organ, tissue, and cell in the body. Because we can't adequately perfuse every cell in the body at any given time, right? So we have to regulate blood flow. So when we're starting to think and we're taking a test or need to call memory, we increase blood flow to the brain. If we're going to start exercise or running, then we got to increase blood flow to the heart and to the skeletal muscles. If we're about to become intimate, then we increase blood flow to the sex organs. But when they're not in use, they're not adequately perfused, or they're not perfused as much as when we use them. So this is the second-to-second regulation of blood flow that determines organ function and why, if you have normal nitric oxide production, you can have normal sexual function, you can have good memory recall, you can train well, you can, run marathons and lift weights without tiring or fatiguing, because we're getting enough oxygen to the cells. The mitochondria are utilizing that oxygen to make energy, and we don't tire. So that's the entire basis of the endothelium. It's the largest organ system in the body. I think there's 60,000 miles of blood vessels throughout the entire human body. And so all of those blood vessels are there to supply and regulate blood flow and oxygen nutrient delivery to that downstream tissue. And that's the role of nitric oxide, is it regulates that oxygen delivery and the function of those downstream cells.
I always find that amazing, the 60,000 miles. And what you said it makes so much sense. Our heart couldn't possibly pump blood to all 60,000 miles simultaneously. We need a much larger chest cavity for that.
No, that's right. No, you would lose perfusion pressure. I mean,
Yeah.
if you dilated all the blood vessels in the body, your heart's not strong enough to generate enough pressure to perfuse the brain, so you'd pass out. So
Wow.
that's the regulation of what we call vasomotor tone of certain vascular beds, where you decrease blood flow at certain times, increase blood flow at other times. But it's on demand and it's upon need.
And so this nitric oxide is always in use. Then we always have some part of our body that's signaling dilation and other parts that are constricting in order to manage the flow and where it goes.
No, that's exactly right. And that's what, when you start to develop a deficiency of nitric oxide, you lose the regulation of blood flow. So we develop things like erectile dysfunction. We become exercise intolerant. And the other important part of nitric oxide is it's involved in insulin signaling and glucose uptake. So, in 2011, we published a very important paper showing that insulin resistance is a symptom of nitric oxide deficiency. So diabetes is really the end stage of nitric oxide deficiency. So nitric oxide is doing many, many things, much more than just simple vasodilation that we thought 30 years ago. It's signaling important intracellular signaling cascades, because the cell senses an external environment. It has this intracellular signaling cascade and then turns on genes, changes the activity of the cell, improves glucose uptake, changes the metabolic pathways of, energy utilization or energy production.
Amazing. And so you'd said that actually its role is much larger than dilation. It also transports the oxygen into the cells. Talk to us a little bit about its role there.
Well, this was an important study published in 2015, more than 10 years ago. And what these researchers showed, and they were at Case Western University, is that you need nitric oxide. So you have to understand a little bit of protein chemistry. So bear with me here. Hemoglobin is the molecule that carries oxygen inside our red blood cells. And so there's two chains. There's an alpha and a beta chain of hemoglobin. But hemoglobin, the red blood cell, when it goes from the arteries to the veins through the capillaries, the oxygen tension changes. right? So we go from fully oxygenated blood on the arteries to deoxygenated blood in the veins, and it returns to the heart, and we pick or the lungs, and we pick up oxygen, and then we have this cardiopulmonary circuit. But hemoglobin has to undergo a conformational change to offload that oxygen. But if there's not nitric oxide bound to a single cysteine residue, an amino acid on the beta chain of hemoglobin, oxygen doesn't come off. And the best example of this was during COVID. It happens every year during influenza, seasonal flu. People get sick and die. 40 to 50,000 people die a year from seasonal flu. But during COVID, this was kind of a more, it's a rhinovirus, it's a coronavirus. But the problem is people developed oxygen deficiency or hypoxia, right? Their blood oxygen saturation would get down in the 80s, sometimes 70s. They would go to the hospital, they'd put them on oxygen that wouldn't improve. They'd put them on a mechanical vent, get them into metabolic acidosis, and they died. So what we're finding was the people who got sick and died from COVID, people get sick and die from flu every year, aren't out of oxygen. They're the people who can't make nitric oxide. The elderly, the diabetics, the hypertensives, the people who've had previous heart attacks. And so what we revealed during COVID, we had a drug in FDA phase 3 clinical trials as an early therapy for COVID, was we would give our nitric oxide drug therapy in just breathing room air. We could restore the functionality of nitric oxide on hemoglobin, and we could see blood oxygen saturation go from 78 to 96 within 6 minutes. So this told us these patients aren't out of oxygen because, the atmosphere is 21% oxygen, and we exhale 15% oxygen. So we only utilize 6% of the oxygen that we inhale. So there's excess oxygen. The problem with these, whether it's emphysema, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, asthma, or even hypoxemia and pulmonary disease from respiratory viruses, is the ability to uptake oxygen and utilize oxygen. And that's because these patients are nitric oxide deficient.
And what causes nitric oxide deficiency?
Look, there's a lot of things, and really it's the American lifestyle. I think what we found, it's poor diet, it's a lot of drug therapy. But to answer that question, we first had to answer, how does the human body make nitric oxide? Because if you don't understand how the human body makes it, then you wouldn't know what questions to ask in order to what leads to a loss of its production. So there's an enzyme in the endothelial cells, we talked about that, called nitric oxide synthase. And things like a sedentary lifestyle render it dysfunctional. Things like a processed diet, high sugar, high carbohydrate diet render it dysfunctional. Things like certain drug therapies like antacids, proton pump inhibitors, disable that enzyme. Things like glyphosate sprayed on our food. And then, certain frequencies like 5G. This is electromagnetic frequencies that disrupt biochemical reactions, because in biochemistry, we're looking at the flow of electrons, the transfer of electrons. And this requires a certain, electrical potential, and frequencies can disrupt that electrical potential. And so we're finding it's causing a lot of endothelial dysfunction and vascular damage in people who may be sensitive to these 5Gs. And then the other pathway we discovered years ago was through the oral bacteria. So then we go, okay, what's causing disruption of the oral bacteria? Well, fluoride in toothpaste, fluoride in drinking water. They put it in drinking water because it kills bacteria. But when we drink that fluoride, it's killing the bacteria in our mouth, in our gut. When we bathe in it, killing the bacteria on our body. And it's a neurotoxin, and it shuts down your thyroid function. So that's number one. Fluoride is a known neurotoxin, and it should be avoided.
Right.
Number two is antiseptic mouthwash. Things like Listerine, which if you watch TV, it says it kills 99.99% of the bacteria in your mouth.
Yikes.
And they advertise this. And we know that dysbiosis causes human disease.
Right.
So you sterilize the human body, you get sick and die.
Yeah.
And they're advertising they're going to sterilize the human body. This amazes me that these companies are out there advertising this and thinking it's a good thing. And consumers believe them. Because 2 out of 3 Americans wake up every morning and use mouthwash.
Wow.
Sterilizing their mouth.
Yeah.
And we and others publish that when you do this, your blood pressure goes up. You're killing the nitric oxide producing bacteria. Your blood pressure goes up. High blood pressure is the number one driver, the number one killer of men and women worldwide. And you lose the protective benefits of exercise. So think about this. If you try to eat the right diet, and you try to exercise, and you think you're getting benefit from that, If you have fluoride in your drinking water, which 73% of Americans in the US have fluoride in their drinking water, if you
Yeah.
use fluoride toothpaste, which 98% of Americans use fluoride toothpaste,
Yeah.
or if you use an antiseptic mouthwash, which 2 out of 3 people do, you get no nitric oxide benefit from your diet, and you get no nitric oxide benefit from exercise.
That's crazy.
I mean, and that's most people. And so you sit back and you wonder, you look at the American population, with the sickest people on earth. 9 out of 10 Americans are metabolically unfit. 2 out of 3 Americans have an unsafe elevation in blood pressure. 2 out of 3 Americans are obese or overweight.
Wow.
And we wonder why. We're watching commercials and buying things like antiseptics, fluoride toothpaste. We're prescribed, antacids. We're prescribed cholesterol lowering medication. All these things disrupt nitric oxide production.
I was personal note, when I was like about 25, they put me on proton pump inhibitors. I had some GERD. And so I remember I was healthy at the time, and I went back to the doctor. I said, okay, well, it seemed to help. When do I get off these things? He goes, you never get off them. And I was like, what? I'm like
See,
25. I'm
no,
like,
but that's a major problem because these drugs were never approved to be used chronically. In fact,
yeah,
all the studies that got them approved by the FDA it was only approved for 7 to 10 days because those were the studies that determined, okay, it's the acute relief of gastroesophageal reflux, but there were no long-term studies until now. Now we're finding, and published studies in the literature tell us that if you've been on PPIs for 3 years, at least 3 years, you have a 40% higher incidence of heart attack, stroke, and Alzheimer's. It's not an increased risk, it's an increase of the actual event. So people who have been on PPIs for more than 3 years have had 40% of them have had heart attacks, Alzheimer's, and strokes because they're shutting down nitric oxide production. And now the most concerning thing is you don't even have to have a prescription for these drugs. You can go to your
no,
drugstore or Walmart and get them over the counter, the Prilosec, the Prevacid, the Nexium.
yeah,
These are deadly, dangerous drugs. And I know people have been on them for 10, 15, 20 years, and they've suffered heart attacks, strokes, and their doctor can't explain it. Well, I can explain it. The science can explain it.
crazy. And the other thing you were talking about being hygienic, I was thinking about how in lab mice, they raise hygienic lab mice and all of the health problems that they have. They purpose.
When I was in academia, we did this. We experimented in germ-free mice. You
Yep.
got to keep them in a sterile environment, and they're grossly unhealthy.
Yeah, they're
And
anxious, depressed.
yeah, and you look at Americans, with the microbiome project being completely mapped out, humans are 10 times more bacterial than we are human cells.
Yep.
We have 10 times more bacteria that colonize in our body, on our body, than we have mammalian cells. In fact, the human genome only codes for about 23,000 gene products. The bacterial microbiome codes for over 3 million gene products. So, and these bacteria, most of them are symbiotic bacteria that are providing the human host with health benefits.
Right.
And so we
Especially when you
know
keep it
that
in
if you
balance.
destroy the microbiome, you cause systemic disease.
Yeah.
And yet we're still over prescribing antibiotics, putting fluoride in the drinking water, fluoride in the toothpaste, promoting antiseptic mouthwash. I get on a plane, they're still giving you the antibacterial wipes. People are sterilizing the environment around them. And I'm going, what the hell is wrong with these people?
Yeah. It's a fear. It's a fear of germs. It was a really good selling, wasn't it?
No, look, it was valid 100 years ago when we didn't know that there was a microbiome. And the use of antibiotics, I don't want to discount it because it saved millions of lives from
Yeah.
infectious disease. But we have to be more judicious in the use of those. And we need to support the microbiome. Because here's what we're finding is if you have a healthy microbiome and you increase the diversity of the microbiome, you don't get sick. Because the good bacteria police the bad bacteria and keep them at bay.
Yeah.
But when you start destroying the microbiome, it allows for these opportunistic pathogens to rear their head, take control of the environment, and make people sick. But
Yeah.
if you have a healthy microbiome, you don't get sick. I haven't been sick from the flu or COVID in more than 20 years.
Wow.
And I was in 26 clinical sites all around the US from 2020 to 2024 when we terminated the study. I didn't wear a mask. I was kicked off planes. I didn't get a shot, and I've never had COVID. So it's not that I'm immune to these. It's not that I lived in a sterile environment. It's just that I support my microbiome, and the bacteria keep you from getting viral infections. And nitric oxide downregulates the ACE2 receptor, which is the site of attachment for the spike protein from the coronavirus. I mean, all this is well elucidated.
Wow. So what do you do to support your microbiome?
Well, I completely avoid fluoride. I have a home filtration system, so I remove fluoride, chloride, and chloramines and everything, all the bad stuff in drinking water. I don't use fluoride toothpaste. I made my own fluoride-free toothpaste with prebiotics that restore the oral microbiome. I typically avoid carbohydrates, high glycemic carbohydrates and sugar, because when you consume those, it completely changes the environment. It lowers the pH of the oral cavity, and that completely changes the ecology of the microbiome. And then I don't take antibiotics. And so I eat a lot of fiber to support the gut microbiome. And we focused and, published probably half a dozen, maybe a dozen papers on identifying these oral bacteria. And so we know how to support them. We know what they like. We know how to create an environment where these bacteria will flourish and grow and overpopulate and, keep you from having bad breath, keep you from having oral infections and maintaining normal blood pressure.
Yeah, and the one thing people don't always recognize is our mitochondria at one point were considered a bacteria. We don't consider them a bacteria anymore. They have their own DNA, and they do act a little bit independently. They've been pretty sheltered from the external world, so they don't have everything we now need to consider it its own bacteria anymore. But we don't even count those when we say the 10-to-1 of other bugs to human cells, so to speak, is the fact they're living inside each cell too.
Yeah, and each cell has many, many mitochondria, hundreds, sometimes thousands of mitochondria per cell, depending upon what the function of that cell is, because some cells need a lot more energy than others.
I actually love this line of conversation. When I was really sick and I started to research on mitochondria and microbiome both, I went pretty deep in those rabbit holes. It hit me at one point as this isn't about me getting me better. I'm like an ecosystem, and you have to almost look at yourself as like an ecosystem, and how do you treat the ecosystem well? Because if you treat your friends well, they'll treat you well, so to speak. And that was kind of a profound moment for me to realize, holy cow, that's
You got to change the terrain. You have to change the terrain. People get sick because they're terrain. Inside their body, outside their body is not healthy. And so my philosophy is give the body what it needs, remove from the body what it doesn't need, and the body heals itself.
Yeah.
So in that paradigm, there's no room for drug therapy. There's no need for drug therapy, right? Because the body is never deficient in a synthetic compound that is inhibiting a biochemical reaction, which is what most drugs are.
Right.
But if we remove toxins and replete missing nutrients, human beings are regenerative by nature, and we heal ourselves. We just got to get out of the way.
Yeah, I always think that when people talk about, when I had autoimmunity, the doctor's like, well, yeah, your immune system's broken and it's attacking itself. And it never sat well with me. I was like, well, how did humans ever make it this far? We've been around 300, 500,000 years, and our systems just break. And I'm like, what were we doing when we were living in the caves? I was like, how did this ever work? And then if you just dig one layer below that narrative, you start to realize that that's not really what's going on. The body is actually doing the right thing. Maybe it's having a hard time clearing whatever it's trying to clear.
Yeah.
But
no, that's right. The human body doesn't make mistakes. I mean, sometimes during, fertilization or gestation, there's some mutations, and sometimes people are born with inborn air metabolism, and those are mistakes, obviously. But the immune system doesn't make a mistake. The human body responds to any stimulus that is given. And so what drug therapy is, it inhibits the response to that.
Yeah.
And so the best example is, and why drug therapy is not making anybody better, is when there's a fire trucks always show up at the fire, right? But if you block the entry of that fire truck to the fire, things burn up. And that's what drug therapy does. Drug therapy inhibits the symptoms that the body's responding to a fire.
Yeah.
And so it's blaming the fire trucks on the fire.
Yeah.
And that's the problem with medicine today. We're not addressing root cause. We're treating symptoms.
They did that to me for a while. That was kind of rough. I had that autoimmune, and then like, hey, we're just going to turn off your immune system. It didn't work out so well.
Good luck.
It helped for a little while, and then I was sicker and sicker, and finally, they got me sick enough. I had to
You
knock
had
a little
enough. You got sick and tired of being sick and tired. Yeah.
So, talk to us a little bit about. So, what can people do to improve their nitric oxide?
Well, it's very simple. You got to stop doing the things that inhibit its production and start doing the things that promote its production.
Yep.
And so we talked a little bit about this. So we have to release the brakes on nitric oxide production. And so what that means is you have to get rid of fluoride. If you live in a municipality where there's fluoride in the drinking water, go to your city council meetings, talk to your mayor, talk to your local representative, and demand that they get fluoride out of the drinking water.
Even if they do,
In 2024, the National Toxicology Program published a very important paper. It was a multi-year dose escalation study that showed that there's no benefit of fluoride.
Yeah.
Zero benefit. It doesn't prevent cavities in kids. And so if there's no benefit, what's the risk? The risk is it lowers IQ by as much as 7 points in kids. It's an antiseptic causing systemic and topical dysbiosis. It's shutting down your thyroid function, and it's a neurotoxin. So when you've got a risk-benefit quotient of no benefit and all risk,
Yeah.
that's a very easy public policy decision. You just eliminate it. You eliminate it from the water supply.
Well, the shocking thing to me was when I started looking into this years ago, is there was never any studies done on it. They literally put a chemical in our drinking supply, and no one ever did a study on it. They just said, hey, some kids in Colorado, they got brown spots in their teeth, and they're not getting cavities. Yeah. So we should do more of that, which is kind of shocking when you get down to it. But, like, even if they take it out now, it's probably lining all the pipes.
Well, it is. Look, fluoride is very difficult to get rid of. It's a very small molecule. If you remember from your high school science class, it's in the upper right-hand corner of the periodic table, which we call those electrophiles. So they like to steal electrons and cause oxidation, and it causes rust. And those of you who have chlorine pools, or it's a halogen. It's the same column as chlorine that you put in pools. It's a strong oxidant. And so it causes rust. And so when we're exposed to that, it causes rust in us and oxidation. And oxidative stress causes chronic disease and rapid age-related disease. So we just have to eliminate that. And then number two, refuse your fluoride rinses from your dentist. If your dentist still uses fluoride, fire that dentist and go find a dentist who knows what he's doing. And then if you're using a fluoride toothpaste, stop. In fact, I encourage you, if you use a fluoride toothpaste, if you're listening to this, go to the bathroom, get your toothpaste, and read the back. Because it'll say, only put a pea-sized amount of toothpaste on your toothbrush. Because that pea-sized amount contains about 0.5 milligram of fluoride. But most people are putting the entire toothpaste on the entire bristle. So now you're getting 5, 10, 15, 20 times more fluoride exposure than what they're recommending. And they also tell you if you swallow this, call poison control, because sodium fluoride is a poison. But what they don't understand is that fluoride has a molecular weight of 19. It's a very small molecule. You don't have to swallow it to be exposed to it. It's absorbed across the oral mucosa. So anytime you brush your teeth or use the fluoride rinse at the dentist or a fluoride toothpaste, you should call poison control. That's what you're advised to do because you're being poisoned. And people don't even realize it.
That's pretty powerful. Yeah, you're right. It is tiny.
Yeah, and then the other thing, so antiseptic mouthwash, fluoride, if you're on antacids, you must get off of them. And then stop eating sugar. Because sugar, when we talk about oxygen delivery by hemoglobin, sugar is very sticky. If you've ever spilt a soda water or sweet tea on the counter, you come back the next day, it's sticky. Or spilled something sweet on the floor. Because glucose is glue. Glucose is what we measure in the blood, fasting glucose levels. And glucose sticks to proteins. It sticks to hemoglobin. In fact, that's what hemoglobin A1C is. It's how much sugar is stuck to hemoglobin. And when hemoglobin is glued together by glucose, it can't undergo that conformational change and deliver oxygen. That's why diabetics have poor blood oxygen saturation. That's why they have diabetic neuropathy. That's why they have diabetic macular degeneration, diabetic retinopathy, poor healing wounds, because they become hypoxic. Hemoglobin can't deliver oxygen If you can't deliver oxygen, those cells, the mitochondria can't produce energy. Those cells can't do their job, and we get sick. And that's the biggest thing is people are over consuming sugar, simple carbohydrates, and causing an increase in blood sugar, increasing insulin secretion. And that's driving the inflammation, oxidative stress, and immune dysfunction that's hallmarks of all chronic disease. So if you just do those four things, get rid of fluoride, no mouthwash, stop using antacids, and eliminate sugar and simple carbs, now you've released the brakes on the body's ability to produce nitric oxide. Now you can exercise 20, 30 minutes of moderate exercise a day, 20, 30 minutes of direct sunlight exposure, nasal breathing. For those that are mouth breathers at night, you got to tape your mouth, breathe through your sinuses, your nasal cavity, because that produces nitric oxide. You deliver it to your lungs, you improve oxygen saturation. And that's why deep breathing exercises can lower blood pressure because it's stimulating nitric oxide production. And then that's it. That's very simple. And then, 18-hour fast every day. I've been doing an 18-hour daily fast for probably 3 to 4 years now and completely resets your metabolism. That's cost savings, right? If you're not eating but twice a day, eat at noon and eat at 6, then don't eat till noon the next day. You're saving money. You're going to increase your metabolic flexibility. You're going to lose weight and you're going to feel better. And those are very simple cost-saving strategies that have been clinically proven to enhance nitric oxide production.
Wow. And if nitric oxide is so important to human health, why does no one know about it?
I think there's several reasons. I've been doing this for almost 30 years. And in the practice of medicine, right, doctors think the only thing that counts is what's counted, right? Doctors don't like to treat things they can't diagnose or measure. So nitric oxide is a gas, and once it's produced, it's gone in less than a second. So that you can't measure it clinically. I mean, in the research, we can measure nitric oxide metabolites and create a fingerprint of endobiology and get a pretty good indication.
Yeah.
But it's not like your triglycerides or vitamin D or magnesium levels that are easily measured, and then we dose up to normal levels or optimal levels. So that's number one. If it's not something we can test, it's not something you treat. And then number two is big pharmaceutical companies for the past 30 years have tried to develop safe and effective nitric oxide drug therapy. And they failed. They've literally failed. Billions of dollars of research go into these projects, and they failed because they don't know how to deliver nitric oxide gas that recapitulates natural endogenous production and natural endogenous signaling. So again, there's no FDA-approved drug for nitric oxide-based therapy except for inhalative nitric oxide therapy that's approved for premature babies born with pulmonary hypertension. But it's in a critical care unit, it's in an in-hospital setting. And so if there's no FDA-approved drug to treat nitric oxide deficiency is not a diagnosable, treatable condition. And that's the problem. But we're advancing the field so much now that we're seeing high blood pressure is a symptom of nitric oxide deficiency. Erectile dysfunction is a symptom of nitric oxide deficiency. Insulin resistance and diabetes is a symptom of nitric oxide deficiency. And that's why these patients are so poorly managed, because even 50% of the people who have high blood pressure who are prescribed prescription medication don't respond with better blood pressure. It's because these drugs aren't designed or targeted toward the root cause of their high blood pressure.
Right.
And same thing with metformin or glucophage or all these, GLP-1 agonists. They're making people lose weight, but they're not improving their metabolism. And you're getting all these side effects because they haven't addressed the root cause, and it's nitric oxide deficiency. But I'm hosting and organizing an international nitric oxide meeting in Austin, April 23rd through the 25th, and we're bringing the world's experts together. Lou Ignarro, the Nobel Prize winner, top researchers around the world coming together to hopefully fill in the gaps of what else do we need to do to advance safe and effective nitric oxide therapy, because nitric oxide therapy will change the world, because there's not a single disease where nitric oxide given at the right dose at the right time in the right patient would not provide benefit. Doesn't matter if it's heart disease, heart failure, pulmonary hypertension, neurovascular disease, dementia, Alzheimer's, autoimmunity. Nitric oxide addresses all of those.
Right. I mean, at the end of the day, every disease is, you've got some component of poor circulation or microcirculation, and oxygen delivery.
That's
So,
right.
if your cells don't have enough energy to do whatever they were made to do, then they're going to do something else and a lot less of it, probably.
No, they become inefficient. And at the end stage of all this metabolic insufficiency or inefficiency is cancer. And that goes back to the 1930s and 40s with Otto Warburg, who described what we call the Warburg effect,
Yep.
where mitochondria become uncoupled and they go through aerobic fermentation, and the efficiency of ATP production decreases by, 90%.
Yeah.
And then you create this environment of low oxygen, low pH, low voltage, and that's where cancer cells proliferate, grow, and replicate.
Yeah.
And that's cancer. Cancer is a metabolic disease characterized by low nitric oxide, mitochondrial dysfunction, and energy inefficiency. And if you can change that environment, you eradicate cancer.
Wow. And what is nitric oxide doing inside the cell versus inside the circulatory system?
Well, inside the cell, it's a cell signaling. So it's part of, what we've characterized the most is insulin signaling. So insulin binds to the insulin receptor, starts this 7-transmembrane intracellular signaling, and then leads to autophosphorylation, and then it starts different kinases or what we call phosphorylation events inside the cell. But then those then activate nitric oxide synthase enzyme. Nitric oxide produced inside the cell can bind to GLUT4, and that translocates GLUT4 to go to the cell membrane to bring glucose into the cell. And that's just one example of nitric oxide being intermediate in insulin signaling and then glucose uptake. Because if the cell can't make nitric oxide, then you develop insulin resistance, and you don't get glucose inside the cell, and blood levels of glucose continue to rise. But
And
that's just one. There's so many others where nitric oxide inside the cell can bind to cysteine residues on proteins, completely change the structure and function of proteins. It can turn genes off, turn genes off. It's called this epigenetic regulation, well-defined role for nitric oxide in the epigenetic, turning genes on and off. So there's over 200,000 scientific papers published in the literature about what the role of nitric oxide and what it's doing inside the cell, how it's affecting physiology, biology, and even the pathology of many diseases.
and is there a way that people can supplement and improve through supplementation their nitric oxide?
Yeah, there is. That's what we've been focused on for the past, 20 years, because once we understood and elucidated these production pathways and what led to a nitric oxide deficiency, then you could start developing rational therapies. So the first thing I tell people is diet is always the best. Diet and exercise is always the first. If you do the right things, then there's no need for supplementation. The problem is that the food that's grown in America, there's 76% less basic micronutrients in food grown in America in the 2010s compared to the 1940s. So unfortunately, the food that was grown in America, we're not getting all the nutrients we need. So we must have to supplement basic micronutrients. And I think people need to do micronutrient analysis, figure out what they're missing, and then supplement that. And then two, in order to get the nitric oxide benefits from the diet, you have to have the right oral bacteria, and you must have stomach acid production. And so that's why it's important to stop fluoride, antiseptic, and acids. But what we've done is different, because what I want to do is if your body can't make nitric oxide, then we got to provide it for you, right? You can't give arginine or beets or all this other crap that companies are selling, because number one, beets aren't nitric oxide. And number two, these products contain arginine or citrulline. The human body is never deficient in arginine or citrulline. And supplements are designed to supplement what's missing.
Right.
We're never deficient in arginine or citrulline. So all products contain arginine or citrulline. That's an easy litmus test. It should tell you that those companies do not understand basic nitric oxide biochemistry, and you shouldn't buy from them. And then the other problem is beets. Companies out there trying to convince you beets are nitric oxide, and beets are not nitric oxide at all. In fact, 99% of the beet products on the market provide no nitric oxide benefit. It's what we call a dead beet. So, a roundabout way to answer your question, what we do is in 2007, we published that nitric oxide is a hormone. And so, in hormone replacement therapy, you give the molecule. Just like in women, postmenopausal women, if you do hormone replacement therapy and estrogen, you don't give them pregnenolone or DHEA and hope their body makes estrogen out of it. No, they've lost that ability. You give them estrogen. Same thing in men with low testosterone. You give them testosterone. It's providing the missing molecule that their body is unable to synthesize anymore. And that's what we do with nitric oxide. So I make an orally disintegrating tablet, you put it in your mouth, and I designed it to dissolve over 5 to 6 minutes. And as it's dissolving, it's liberating 20 to 30 parts per million nitric oxide gas. Those are therapeutic amounts that are delivered to premature babies born with pulmonary hypertension.
Wow.
And my rationale on that was if this amount of nitric oxide is safe in the most vulnerable, high-risk population on Earth, a premature baby born at 27, 28, 30 weeks, and it's safe and it's saving their lives because it's opening up the pulmonary arteries and improving tissue oxygenation and blood oxygen saturation and turning blue babies to nice pink babies, then it would be safe for an adult. So that was my metric. And so we produce nitric oxide. If your body can't make it, we provide it for you. But also we're fixing the enzyme in the lining of the blood vessels. In fact, we see about a 20 to 40% improvement in endogenous nitric oxide production in the lining of the blood vessels within 20 minutes taking that lozenge. And because it's residing in the mouth for 5 to 6 minutes, it's changing the microbiome, it's improving the diversity of the microbiome, it's selectively killing oral pathogens and improving the diversity of the non-pathogenic commensal bacteria.
Wow, that's amazing. So the lozenge was obviously a specific choice. Is that so it could be absorbed through the thin tissues in the mouth?
Well, you got to understand nitric oxide's a gas, right? You can't put a gas in a capsule and swallow it. Right.
Yep.
And you can't find a gas in beets or gummies or chews. The gas isn't there. So what we had to do is get creative and create some natural product chemistry and put it in this matrix. And when this matrix falls apart, these actives come together to generate the gas. And that's how we do this, that nobody else, even the big drug companies have been unsuccessful at trying to figure out. But it's not only is it safe, but it's very effective. In fact, we're developing drug therapy. So we not only have products on the market in dietary supplements and nutritional products and nitric oxide skincare and oral care products, but we're taking this through FDA to get approval for drug therapy for things like heart disease. We've got a drug for Alzheimer's. We make a topical drug for diabetic ulcers and non-healing wounds. And remarkably, we've never seen any adverse side effects. We haven't seen a wound that we haven't been able to heal with our topical nitric oxide. We're seeing, people with ischemic heart disease, we're seeing about 11% regression of heart disease after 6 months. We're seeing people with mild cognitive disorders and dementia and even Alzheimer's get better, recall memory, improving cerebral blood flow, improving glucose uptake in the brain, and completely, reversing and slowing the progression of Alzheimer's and even in some cases reversing it. All with giving a single molecule nitric oxide.
Amazing. So, last question for you. You've been studying this for decades. What's one thing you feel like the medical community is still missing about nitric oxide? It's clearly super powerful and important.
That how it's delivered, right? Because nitric oxide, the medical field for many years didn't think that nitric oxide was druggable, meaning that we couldn't target a specific molecule to. And let me go back, because the way pharmacology works is you develop synthetic inhibitors of a biochemical reaction. Like non-steroidal anti-inflammatories. Many of these are inhibiting cyclooxygenase reaction, and it's reducing inflammation. They're non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. But they're inhibitors. They're inhibitors of drugs. But because there's never a condition where there's overproduction of nitric oxide causing systemic disease, it would be easy. In fact, NOS inhibitors, nitric oxide inhibitors, have been synthesized and manufactured for 40 years. But because there's never a condition of overproduction of nitric oxide, giving an inhibitor as a drug therapy isn't going to provide benefit. So then the question is, how do we deliver nitric oxide gas safely and effectively? And when nitric oxide is produced or delivered in the body, it's gone in less than a second.
Wow.
So how do we recapitulate that in a drug therapy setting? And that's been kind of my work, and the riddle that I've solved is we know how to generate nitric oxide at rates and fluxes that recapitulate production and signaling. And furthermore, we know when nitric oxide is produced, we understand where it goes, what it becomes, and how it's signaled. And so all of that is contained in that orally disintegrating tablet technology that's not only been proven safe for dietary supplements, but we're developing it as drug therapy to prove efficacy in these different disease conditions that'll completely change the world, and it will change the landscape of medicine once we get this through the FDA and get drug approval. And
Amazing.
many pharmaceutical companies don't like what we're doing because it'll put them out of business. Because when we start getting people restoring normal physiology, and what we do, we're a biotech company, but we're not a pharmaceutical company. We don't employ pharmacology. We employ principles of restorative physiology. And years ago, decades ago, 1,000 years ago, when medicine was first practiced, medicine was called applied physiology, right? Understand the physiology and apply that back to the patient. Today, medicine is applied pharmacology, right? Giving a synthetic compound that these companies patent to inhibit a biochemical reaction, but it hasn't made anybody better. So we got
Yeah.
to get back to the basics. We call this restorative physiology, and that's what we do. But that's what pharmaceutical companies don't understand. That's what doctors don't understand, because doctors operate within the confines of what's called the standard of care.
Yep.
They make a diagnosis. Once you make a diagnosis, there's only a finite number of solutions you can prescribe
Yeah.
for that diagnosis. Number one, to get paid, for insurance to reimburse it, and for you to operate within the standard of care. And if you operate outside the standard of care, you may lose your medical license. So the system is horribly, horribly broken.
So, man, I would love to go on another hour with you. If people want to learn more about some of the amazing stuff you're doing and some of your products, where can they find you?
Well, first thing, I would recommend you read my latest book called The Secret of Nitric Oxide, Bring the Science to Life. This book here, I published it last year and launched it on Fox and Friends in New York. But this tells the whole story of nitric oxide, how it was discovered, what led to a Nobel Prize, and then the discoveries we made that led us to where we are today. So it's an absolute must read. If I say there's only two people who should be concerned with nitric oxide: people who are sick and want to get well, and people who are well and don't want to get sick. So if you fall within one of those two categories, you have to read this book. And then, I'm searchable on most search engines. You can find me on PubMed. You can put my name in there for their publications. I'm on Instagram, Dr. Nathan S. Bryan, same on LinkedIn. X or Twitter, I'm Dr. Nitric. And then for those of you interested in product technology, it's n101.com. It's the letter N, number one, letter O, number one.com. So for nitric oxide, one nitrogen, one oxygen, n101.com.
Amazing. Hey, thank you so much, Nathan, for joining us on the show and educating us about this. It's so important and really enjoyed our time together.
Well, thank you, Brad, for having me. And it's good to see you and hope to see you soon.
Sounds great. Thank you.